I have designed structures that carry the weight of thousands without flinching. I have buried a wife, raised a son, and built a reputation in this city that outlasted every storm thrown at it. But nothing, not one moment in 68 years of living, prepared me for walking into that building on a Tuesday afternoon and finding my son on his knees. Not in prayer, not in proposal, on his knees on a marble floor, polishing another man's shoes, while that man looked down at him and laughed, and said the words that turned something quiet and permanent in me. That's all he's good for. I smiled. I said nothing. I left, and then I made a phone call that changed everything. Welcome back to your ultimate destination for gripping revenge stories, family betrayals, shocking betrayals, and emotional justice. Subscribe now and join a community and tell us where you're watching from. Turn on the notification bell for our next story. Are you ready to witness the ultimate payback? Let's get started. I am Mr. ZAHA, and I am 68 years old. Before I tell you what I saw in that building, I need to tell you about my son. Because what I saw only makes full sense if you understand who Elias ZAHA was before he walked into the orbit of Gerald Whitmore and his company and his daughter and his particular brand of slow, smiling destruction. You need to understand what was there before it was diminished, the way you need to understand the original load-bearing capacity of a structure before you can fully comprehend what the damage means. Elias James ZAHA was 34 years old. He was my only son. I had a daughter, Miriam, 3 years older, who lived in Nashville and called me every Sunday and had her mother's laugh and my stubbornness and had built a life of quiet, sturdy happiness that I thought about with uncomplicated pride. But Elias was the complicated one. The one who had always required more from me and given more back. The one whose particular combination of gifts and vulnerabilities had kept me up more nights than I could count. He was brilliant. I want to say that plainly, because it matters, and because what happened to him was not the result of inadequacy. Elias was brilliant in the way of people who see patterns that others miss, who make connections across disciplines with a fluency that looks effortless from the outside and is, in fact, the result of a mind that never stops working. He had graduated from Duke with a degree in business and economics, had gotten his MBA from Wake Forest, and had entered the professional world with the particular combination of intellectual capacity and genuine warmth that should have made him formidable. His mother, Diane, had been the emotional architecture of his childhood. She had given him her warmth, her social intelligence, her ability to walk into a room and understand its dynamics within minutes. I had given him my analytical precision, my work ethic, and, this is the thing I have spent time being honest with myself about, my tendency to expect excellence as the baseline rather than celebrating it as the achievement. Diane used to say, gently, that I forgot to tell Elias when he was doing well, because I was always looking at how he could do better. She was right. I did that. I have been honest about it since she died. Diane, who left us 7 years ago from a heart condition that announced itself without warning on a Monday morning in April, leaving a space in the family that has never fully closed. After she was gone, Elias and I had navigated our relationship with the particular difficulty of two people who had always communicated through a third person who no longer existed to facilitate the translation. We loved each other. We did not always know how to show it. Elias had met Camille Whitmore at a professional networking event in Charlotte 3 years ago. He had called me the week after to tell me about her, and in his voice I had heard something I had not heard in a long time. The particular quality of a man who has encountered someone who reorganizes his sense of what is possible. He was lit up. Genuinely, completely lit up. Camille, he told me, was smart and funny and grounded, and she made him feel, in her presence, like the best version of himself. I was glad for him. Genuinely glad. A father wants his son to find that. A father whose wife is gone wants, perhaps with special intensity, to see his son find a partner who does what a great partner does, who makes the ordinary days richer and the hard days survivable. I met Camille 4 months into their relationship. She was exactly what Elias had described, warm, direct, with an easy intelligence and a genuine kindness that I recognized and respected. She was also Gerald Whitmore's daughter, which I noted and did not weight too heavily, the way you note a variable in a calculation without yet knowing its significance. Gerald Whitmore. I need to tell you about Gerald Whitmore. Gerald was 61 years old, the founder and CEO of Whitmore Commercial Properties, a real estate development, and property management company based in Charlotte that he had built over 30 years into something genuinely substantial. It occupied 11 floors of a building downtown, employed over 300 people, and had Gerald's name on it in the way that some men's names get onto buildings, not just as branding, but as identity, as the extension of a particular ego into permanent form. He was, in the social sense of the word, impressive. He was tall, silver-haired, with the physical confidence of a man who had been the most important person in most rooms for most of his adult life. He dressed expensively without appearing to try. He shook hands with the practiced warmth of a man who understood that likability was a professional asset and had cultivated it with the same deliberateness he applied to everything else. He was also, I came to understand, over 3 years of family dinners and holiday gatherings, a man who organized his relationships around a fundamental hierarchy. At the top of the hierarchy was Gerald. Below Gerald were the people who were useful to Gerald. Below them were the people who required management. And at the bottom, and this category was the one I did not fully understand until the Tuesday afternoon that everything changed, were the people Gerald considered beneath him, whose diminishment was not cruelty in his framework, but simply the accurate recognition of an objective fact. Elias had gone to work at Whitmore Commercial 18 months ago. This had been Gerald's suggestion, offered at a family dinner, presented as an opportunity, framed as the kind of gesture a generous father-in-law makes for a son-in-law he believes in. Camille had been enthusiastic. Elias had been, I thought, slightly hesitant in the way of a man who was not entirely sure the offer was what it was presenting itself as, but who wanted very much to believe it. I had asked Elias, privately, whether he was comfortable with it, whether he had thought about what it meant to work for your father-in-law, about the particular dynamics that created, the way it positioned him in the company and in the family simultaneously. He had listened to my concern with the careful attention he brought to conversations where he knew I was trying to say something important and was watching to see if I managed to say it. I know, Dad, he'd said. I've thought about it. But Gerald believes in me. He's offering me a real opportunity. And Camille's excited about it. I had accepted that, filed the concern in the back drawer, and let Elias make his choice, because he was 34 years old and had the right to make it, and because, this is the part one have sat with, I had not pushed further, not said what I was actually afraid of, not found the words to tell my son that the thing I was worried about was not the professional opportunity, but the power arrangement it created. I should have found those words. Over the following 18 months, I watched Elias change. Gradually, with the slow imperceptibility of structural settling, the kind of change you only see clearly in retrospect, when you compare the current state to the original. He called less frequently. When we spoke, there was a new quality in his voice, a careful quality, a managed quality, as though he was translating what he actually wanted to say into a version that was safe to transmit. He had lost some quality of directness that had always been characteristic, some quality of confidence. I noticed. I mentioned it once, carefully, and he said he was fine. He was just busy. Work was demanding. I accepted that. I should not have accepted that. Miriam called me from Nashville in September and said, Daddy, something is wrong with Elias. I can hear it. Have you talked to him? I've tried, I said. Try harder, she said, with the directness of a daughter who has inherited her father's precision and has no patience for its social applications. I tried harder. I got closer to the surface of it without breaking through, Elias deflecting with the practiced ease of a man who has been managing perceptions for long enough that the management has become automatic. So I decided to visit him at work. Unannounced. Not to spy. I want to be clear about the intention. I wanted to see him in his environment. To see what the daily texture of his professional life looked like. To bring him lunch and sit across from him at his desk and watch him be himself in the place where he spent most of his waking hours. I drove to Whitmore Commercial Properties on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and I took the elevator to the 7th floor, where Elias had told me his office was. I stepped out of the elevator into a corridor of glass-walled offices and the particular polished busyness of a professional operation running at capacity. And then I saw my son. He was in the corridor, 20 feet from the elevator, outside the door of what I would later understand was Gerald Whitmore's office suite. He was on his knees on the marble floor. He had a cloth in his hand. He was polishing a pair of shoes. Gerald Whitmore's shoes. While Gerald Whitmore stood above him, talking on his cell phone, looking down at Elias the way you look down at furniture, and smiling at something the person on the other end of the phone had said. I stood at the elevator and I watched this for approximately 5 seconds before Gerald looked up and saw me. He did not stop smiling. If anything, the smile widened, not with welcome, but with the particular satisfaction of a man who has been seen doing something he is not ashamed of, who wanted to be seen. He looked at me. He looked down at Elias. He said, into the phone, but loud enough, deliberately loud enough, for the corridor to hear, "Hold on, Brent." Then, to the air above my son's head, with the easy amusement of a man commenting on the weather. "That's all he's good for." He went back to his phone call. Elias, on the floor, had gone very still. I stood at the elevator and I looked at my son, kneeling on marble, and I felt something move through me that I have no single accurate word for. It was not simply anger, though anger was in it, clean and cold and absolute. It was not simply grief, though grief was there too, the specific grief of a father who sees his child diminished and understands how long the diminishment has been occurring. It was something older than both. Something that reached back past Elias to my father's workshop and the integrity of the thing you make and the keeping of your word, and it said, "This ends." I looked at Gerald Whitmore, still on his phone, still smiling. I smiled back. I turned around. I got back in the elevator. And in the elevator, going down, I took out my phone and I called my attorney. Tell me in the comments, what are you feeling right now? What would you have done if you walked in and saw what Mr. ZAHA just saw? Act 2. The call and what it said in motion. Catalyst, approximately 1,700 words. My attorney's name was David Marsh. I had worked with David for 19 years, since the mid-2000s, when I had needed legal counsel for a professional dispute on a major infrastructure project, and the counsel David had provided had been so thorough and so strategically precise that I had never used anyone else for anything that mattered. He was 62, meticulous, and possessed of the particular quality I value most in people whose judgment I rely on. He did not tell me what I wanted to hear. He told me what was true. He answered on the third ring. "David," I said. I was in the lobby of the Whitmore Commercial Building. The marble floors of the lobby gleamed. The company name was on the wall in brushed steel letters. I looked at it. "I need you to pull everything you can find on Whitmore Commercial Properties. Financial filings, debt structure, liabilities, pending litigation, contractual obligations. Everything." A brief silence. David, who knew me well enough to understand that unscheduled calls with this quality of directness were not preliminary discussions, said, "How quickly?" "As quickly as thorough allows," I said. "Can you tell me what I'm looking for?" "I'll know it when you show it to me," I said. But David, look specifically at their debt service obligations, their refinancing history, their vendor contracts, particularly anything with renewal clauses or exit provisions, and any public-facing commitments, announced projects, partnership agreements, anything they've told the market they're doing. Another brief silence. Then ZAHA. "This is a significant operation. If you're thinking about what I think you're thinking about, the timeline and the capital requirements are." "I have the capital," I said. "Find me the leverage." I hung up. I want to explain something about that call, because I recognize how it sounds. It sounds like a man acting from rage, from the hot, immediate fury of a father who has seen his son humiliated and is reaching for the most destructive available response. And rage was there. I will not pretend it wasn't. The image of Elias on the marble floor was not going to leave my mind in the next several hours, and the clean cold fury of it was a presence in my chest that I was fully aware of. But the call to David was not rage. It was something more deliberate. Here is the thing about anger. At 68, after the life I have lived, you learn the difference between anger as weather and anger as information. Weather is the immediate storm, the heat, the impulse, the thing that makes you want to act before you think. Information is what remains after the weather passes, the cold, clear signal that something has been wrong for a long time and has now become visible, and that the visibility requires a response. The image of Elias on the marble floor was information. It told me that what had been happening to my son in that building was not a one-time event. You don't kneel on a marble floor and polish a man's shoes casually, the first time someone asks. You do it because a pattern has established it as acceptable, because a dynamic has developed over months that has normalized it, because you have been, gradually and methodically, reduced to a position where it happens and you don't know how to refuse it. Gerald Whitmore had been constructing something in that building for 18 months. He had taken my son, brilliant, warm, capable Elias, and he had used the leverage of employment and the leverage of family and the particular slow pressure of a powerful man with contempt in his smile to bring him to his knees. Literally. And he had wanted me to see it. I was certain of that. The timing of the phone call, the volume of the comment, the way the smile had widened when he saw me at the elevator, that was not an accident. That was a man delivering a message. This is what your son is in my world. This is where he belongs. The message had been received. Now I would send one back. I drove home. I spent 2 hours on the phone with various parties, not the aggressive calls of an angry man, but the systematic, information-gathering calls of an engineer identifying load points before he applies pressure. I called people I knew in Charlotte's business community, people I had worked with over 3 decades, people who knew Gerald Whitmore's reputation from the inside. What I learned in those 2 hours filled in the picture that the marble floor lobby had started. Gerald Whitmore was a man who collected dependencies. He liked people in positions of obligation, employees with no good options, partners with contractual exposure, family members whose access to his goodwill was contingent on their compliance with his hierarchy. He had, over 30 years of business, built not just a company, but a system. A carefully engineered system of leverage and obligation in which Gerald was always the load-bearing element, and everyone else was weight he carried at his discretion and could set down at will. Elias had entered that system as a son-in-law, which Gerald had understood, from the beginning, as a category with particular utility. A son-in-law was family-adjacent, which gave the arrangement a warmth of framing. But he was also an employee, which meant his continued position was contingent on Gerald's goodwill. And he was Camille's husband, which meant his marriage and his employment were structurally connected. Any resistance to the professional dynamic risked the personal one. Gerald had not constructed a relationship with Elias. He had constructed a trap, and he had made the trap look like an opportunity, and Elias, who had wanted so much to believe the opportunity was real, had walked into it. I was not going to burn the trap down in a rage. I was going to dismantle it the way you dismantle a faulty structure, from the foundation up, carefully, with full understanding of which elements carried load and what would happen when they were removed. David called me back 2 days later. I have what you asked for, he said. And ZAHA, you were right to look at the debt service. A pause. This company has been running on a refinancing cycle that works only as long as their credit relationships hold. They have 3 major credit facilities coming up for renewal in the next 14 months. They have a development project on the east side of Charlotte, 12-story mixed use, announced publicly 18 months ago, significant investor commitments. That is 18 months behind schedule and over budget by a margin that would be survivable with favorable credit conditions and catastrophic without them. Tell me about the investors, I said. David told me about the investors. I listened with the focused attention of an engineer reading a structural report. I made notes. I asked precise questions. I built, over the course of that phone call, a clear picture of where the load was concentrated in Gerald Whitmore's carefully constructed system, where the weight was being carried by elements that could be affected, where the application of the right pressure at the right point would not simply damage a structure, but fundamentally compromise its integrity. What are you thinking? David asked. I'm thinking, I said, that a company this leveraged needs its credit relationships more than it needs almost anything else. And I'm thinking that a man who has spent 30 years building a system where everything depends on him is also a man who has built a system where everything falls with him. David was quiet for a moment. You have relationships with 3 of the institutions in their credit structure, he said. I do. If those relationships were leveraged. Carefully, I said. Legally. Not coercively. I'm not suggesting anything improper. I'm suggesting that there are institutions who trust my assessment of risk, and if my assessment of Whitmore Commercial's risk profile were communicated through appropriate channels, those institutions might choose to revisit their credit decisions in ways that are entirely within their rights. Another pause. And the development project investors? I know 2 of them personally, I said. If they understood the full picture of the project status, information that is, incidentally, material to their investment and that they may not have been provided with full transparency on, they might have questions for Gerald that Gerald would struggle to answer. David said, ZAHA, this is not a small thing. No, I said. It is not. If this works the way you're describing, this company faces a debt crisis it may not recover from. I know, I said. A long pause. Are you sure? I thought about the marble floor. About my son's still hands holding a polishing cloth. About Gerald Whitmore's smile, and the 4 words delivered into a phone with the casual ease of a man who had never once imagined there would be consequences. I'm sure, I said. But even as I said it, even as the cold, deliberate machinery of what I was setting in motion continued to turn, there was something else. Something that David had not asked about and that I had not yet addressed. Something that had been sitting at the back of my attention since Tuesday afternoon and that I could not act on until I had spoken to the person who mattered most. Elias. My son did not know I had been in that building. He did not know what I had seen. He did not know about the call to David or the 2 hours of subsequent calls or what I was now putting in motion. And before any of it went further, before the machinery completed another rotation, I needed to talk to my son. Not about what I was doing. About what had been done to him. The plan is in motion. But there's something Mr. ZAHA still has to do first. Tell me in the comments. Should he tell Elias what he saw? What would you do in his position? I called Elias on a Thursday evening and asked him to come for dinner on Saturday. Just dinner. I gave him no other framing, no warning of what I had seen, no indication that anything had changed from the ordinary texture of a father asking his son to come over. I cooked the pot roast he had loved since childhood, the one his mother used to make. The recipe I had spent an afternoon reconstructing after Diane died, because the smell of it in the kitchen was the closest thing to having her in the room. He arrived at 6 o'clock. He was in weekend clothes, jeans, a flannel shirt, the relaxed version of Elias that I saw less and less frequently, and that reminded me, every time, of who he was before the 18 months of gradual diminishment. He looked tired. He looked, underneath the smile he produced at the door, like a man who had been carrying something heavy and had become so accustomed to the weight that he'd stopped consciously registering it. He hugged me at the door. "Smells good, Dad." "Sit down," I said. "It's almost ready." We ate. We talked about Miriam. She had called that week with news of a promotion at her firm in Nashville, and I had the double pleasure of sharing it fresh and watching Elias's face do what it always did when he talked about his sister, open up. The competitive edge that occasionally complicated things fell away when it was about Miriam's success, and what remained was simple, clean love. He was proud of her. He showed it without calculation. I waited until the meal was over, until we had the quiet of the table after eating and coffee in front of us, in the kitchen doing its evening sounds around us. Then I said, with the directness my father had installed in me, so deeply it operated independent of comfort, "Elias, I came to see you at the office on Tuesday." He went still. Not the stillness of surprise, the stillness of something anticipated finally arriving, of a man who has been braced for a specific thing and now feels its approach. "I know," he said. I looked at him. "You know? Gerald told me," he said. His voice was careful, managed in the way his voice had become over the past year and a half. "He mentioned you'd stopped by." A pause. "He said you left without saying anything." "I did," I said. Elias looked at his coffee cup. He turned it in his hands, a gesture I recognized from his childhood, the handling of a small object when the interior pressure needed somewhere to go. "I should explain," he started. "You don't owe me an explanation," I said. "That's not why I'm bringing it up." He looked up. "Then why?" "Because I want you to tell me," I said. "What happened? How it got to that? Not the corporate version, not the version where you're managing what I think, the real version. How it started. How long it's been like this." The kitchen was very quiet. He turned the coffee cup for a long time. "It started small," he said finally. "It was always framed as, Gerald has a way of framing things. He makes things feel like opportunities when they're happening. Like you should be grateful." He paused. "The first time he asked me to stay late to reorganize his office files, he made it sound like he was trusting me with something important. Like it was a demonstration of confidence." A pause. I knew something was off, but I couldn't find the exact edge of it to push back on. Because each individual thing was small, reasonable even, and saying no to any of it felt like being difficult, like being ungrateful. I listened. I did not offer what he was saying toward any conclusion. I just let it come at its own pace. "The shoes," he stopped. His jaw tightened. "He asked me to polish them once about 6 months ago. We were about to go into an investor meeting, and he said there was a scuff on one of them, and he had a cloth in his desk, and could I just get that before we went in?" He looked at the table, and I did, because we were about to go into a meeting and it was fast, and it seemed like a nothing thing. He paused, and then it became a thing. Not asked every time, just assumed. And then last Tuesday he had a call, and the shoes were there, and he stopped. You just did it, I said. I just did it, he said. Dad, I know how it looks. I know what you saw. I've been trying to. He stopped again. His voice had lost its managed quality. What was under it was something rawer, the exhausted, grinding honesty of a man who has been maintaining a performance for so long that he has forgotten how much of himself the performance has consumed. I've been trying to figure out how to get out of it. But my job is there. My marriage. Camille is his daughter, and she doesn't see it. She genuinely doesn't see what he does. And if I try to tell her, she'll think I'm attacking her father, and I can't. He stopped. I can't afford to lose the marriage trying to fix the job, and I can't fix the job without risking the marriage. I'm stuck. I looked at my son, at 34 years old, with his mother's warmth and my precision, stuck in a trap that had been built to look like an opportunity by a man who was good at building traps. Elias, I said, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be fully honest with me. He looked up. If the job were gone, if Whitmore Commercial were not a factor, do you believe Camille would stay? Not out of obligation, out of actual love for you. He thought about that, really thought about it. Not the reflexive reassurance of a man defending his marriage, but the genuine, considered assessment of someone who knows the person they married. Yes, he said. If it were just about us, yes. She loves me. I know that. He paused. It's complicated because of her father. But if Gerald weren't, he stopped. If the dynamic with Gerald weren't in the middle of everything, I think we'd be fine. I think we'd be more than fine. Okay, I said. Why are you asking that? Because I need to know what I'd be protecting and what I'd be risking, I said. He looked at me carefully. Dad, what are you doing? I looked at my son across the kitchen table, thought about how much to say, decided on honesty, because Elias had just given me honesty, and it was the least I owed him in return. I'm addressing the situation, I said, carefully, legally, in a way that protects you and Camille to the greatest extent possible. I paused, but I need to know something before it goes further. Do you want to stay in that company? Is there anything in that job that you want to preserve? He stared at me for a long moment. No, he said. There's nothing in that job I want to preserve. A pause. But Dad, if you do something that damages Gerald's company and Camille finds out you did it, she will find out eventually, I said. The question is what the full truth is when she does. Whether what she finds out is that her father is who I believe him to be, and that addressing it was necessary, or whether she only gets part of the picture. Elias was quiet. There's something else, I said. Something I haven't told you yet. I paused. When I left the building on Tuesday, I went back to the elevator, and I didn't see you see me. But Gerald did. He saw me standing at the elevator, and he looked down at you, and he said, into the phone, but loud enough for the corridor. That's all he's good for. The kitchen was absolutely silent. Elias looked at me. The color in his face had shifted, not drained, but changed in the way that faces change when a truth that has been circling finally lands. He wanted me to hear that, I said. He wanted me to leave that building carrying that sentence. Elias looked at his hands on the table. Yeah, he said, very quietly. That sounds like him. It was a message to me, I said, and I received it. I reached across the table and put my hand over my son's. Not a gesture I made easily, not the engineer's instinct, which was to build and provide rather than touch. But Diane had always touched first and thought later, and I was trying, in the years since I lost her, to reverse the ratio. You are my son, I said. You are the product of everything your mother and I had that was good. You are brilliant and you are capable and you are worth more, in every measurable and unmeasurable sense, than what has been made of you in that building. I paused, and I am going to make sure Gerald Whitmore understands that, in the clearest possible terms, in the language he understands best. Elias looked at me for a long time. Don't destroy my marriage doing it, he said. That, I said, is exactly what I'm trying not to do. Father and son, finally at the table together. Tell me in the comments, what do you think needs to happen next? What should Elias do? What should Mr. ZAHA do about Camille? Act 4. The language Gerald understood. Climax, approximately 1,800 words. What followed over the next 3 weeks was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There was no confrontation in a lobby. No shouted accusations in a boardroom. No moment where I stood over Gerald Whitmore with the evidence of his cruelty and watched him crumble. That is not how the kind of thing I was doing works. What I was doing worked the way structural failure works, below the surface, in the load-bearing elements, invisible until the moment it wasn't. David was meticulous. He was also, in the way of a good attorney who has worked with the same client for 19 years, capable of reading exactly how far his client intended to go and calibrating his work accordingly. He did not ask me again whether I was sure. He had asked once, I had answered, and David respected the architecture of a decision that had been properly made. The credit institutions were first. I had relationships with 2 of the 3 banks carrying Whitmore Commercial's primary credit facilities. Relationships built over decades of doing exactly what I said I would do, delivering exactly what I said I would deliver, and never asking for anything I hadn't earned the right to ask for. That last part mattered enormously. When I called the relevant officers at each institution, I was not calling as a man pulling strings. I was calling as a man with a professional track record that gave his risk assessments weight. I told them what David had found. The debt service cycle. The development project's timeline and budget reality. The gap between what had been publicly communicated and what the actual project status was. I told them clearly that I was not directing their decisions. I was a long-time customer sharing a risk assessment that I believed was material to decisions they would be making in the coming months. I told them they should request updated documentation from Whitmore Commercial before proceeding with any refinancing discussions. Then I waited. Banks, when their interest is alerted to potential risk in a credit relationship, do not move slowly. Within 2 weeks, both institutions had sent information requests to Whitmore Commercial. Detailed, specific requests of the kind that go to a company's financial officer and immediately travel to the CEO because of what they signal. The kind of requests that say, without saying it, we are looking more carefully than you expected us to. The development project investors came next. I had personal relationships with 2 of the 4 primary investors, men I had worked alongside on previous projects, men whose trust in my judgment was the accumulated result of years of professional honesty. I did not frame my communications to them as accusations. I framed them as questions. Had they received updated timeline and budget documentation from Whitmore Commercial recently? Were they comfortable with the current project status? Had they been informed of the scope changes that had occurred in the last 2 quarters? Questions with the quality of a professional engineer asking about structural integrity. Questions that, once asked, could not be unasked. Those investors sent their own requests to Gerald. By the end of the 3rd week, David told me that Whitmore Commercial's CFO had been in contact with 3 law firms and that Gerald himself had canceled several public engagements. The company's announced development project was beginning to attract attention from the Charlotte business press. Questions about timeline, questions about investor confidence, questions that had not been publicly asked before, and that Gerald, who had spent 30 years controlling his company's narrative, was not equipped to deflect when they arrived from multiple directions simultaneously. The machinery was working. And then Camille called me. She called on a Saturday morning, which was not our usual pattern. Camille communicated with me the way daughter-in-laws communicate with fathers-in-law when the relationship is warm but not primary, through Elias, mostly, supplemented by the direct contact of occasions and emergencies. A Saturday morning call, alone, without Elias's facilitation, was an occasion or an emergency. Mr. ZAHA, she said. Her voice was careful, controlled in the way of a woman who has prepared for a conversation and is determined to have it on her own terms. Camille, I said. Good morning. I need to talk to you, she said. About my father's company. About what's been happening. I sat down. Go ahead, I said. My father believes someone has been systematically contacting his credit relationships and his investors, she said. His CFO has told him that the inquiries all point to the same source. That someone with significant relationships in Charlotte's financial community has been raising questions about the company in ways that are, she paused, in ways that are very specifically targeted. I said nothing. Mr. ZAHA, she said. Did you do this? I thought about Elias's face across the kitchen table. About his request, don't destroy my marriage doing it. About what I owed Camille, who was not Gerald and who had loved my son genuinely, and who was now sitting between 2 fires that she had not started and that were burning the landscape of her family. Yes, I said. A long silence. Why? Her voice had changed. The prepared quality had given way to something rawer. Why would you? Camille, I said, I need to tell you something. And I need you to listen to all of it before you respond. Can you do that? A pause. Yes. I told her about Tuesday afternoon. About the elevator and the marble floor and the polishing cloth and the words delivered into a phone for the corridor to hear. I told her with precision, not with heat, not with the language of accusation, but with the factual specificity of a witness recounting what he saw. I told her the date, the time, the exact wording. I gave her the full account. Then I told her what David had found. About the debt structure, the development project, the gap between the public narrative and the actual status. I told her that her father had built his company on leverage that worked only as long as no one looked too closely, and that what I had done was help people who deserved accurate information receive it. And then I told her about Elias. About the 18 months I had watched my son's voice change on the phone. About Miriam's call from Nashville saying something was wrong. About the pattern that David's investigation and Elias's kitchen table honesty had together revealed. The slow, methodical reduction of a man by the person who was supposed to be his professional advocate. Camille was silent for a long time after I finished. Did Elias know you were doing this? She asked. He knew I was doing something, I said. He asked me not to damage your marriage in the process. That's why I'm talking to you right now. Because he loves you. And because you deserve the truth. Another long silence. The shoes, she said finally. Her voice had gone very quiet. He polished my father's shoes? Yes. While my father was on the phone. Yes. And he said, yes. I heard her breathing. The slow, deliberate breathing of a woman processing something that was rearranging her understanding of the world she thought she knew. I didn't know, she said. I want you to know that. I didn't know what was happening at the office. My father, she stopped. My father is a complicated man. I know that. I've always known that. But I didn't know he was. I believe you, I said. Does Elias think I knew? No, I said. He doesn't. He has been protecting you from it because he loves you, and because he was afraid that if he told you, you'd be forced to choose between him and your father, and he didn't want to put you in that position. Another silence. This one different, with a different quality. The silence of a woman who has just been handed a complete picture that she was previously seeing in fragments, and who is now understanding the full shape of what her husband has been carrying alone. Mr. ZAHA, she said. Yes. I need to talk to my husband. I think that's exactly right, I said. And then, she stopped. I think I need to have a very different conversation with my father. I said nothing. That was her territory, not mine. Gerald Whitmore was her father, and the accounting between them was between them. I had done what I could do from my position. The rest was hers. One more thing, she said, before she hung up. Yes. Elias, her voice shifted. Something opening in it. The sound of a woman arriving at something she should have said sooner. Elias is brilliant. I know you know that, but I want you to hear me say it. He is brilliant and he is good, and what my father did to him is, she stopped. It's not something I can excuse. Even for my father. I know, I said. I'm glad you called David, she said. She hung up. I sat for a long time with the phone in my hand and the Saturday morning moving through my windows, and I thought about what was in motion now and where it would land, and whether I had done the right thing in the right way. I thought about Elias's request, don't destroy my marriage, and I thought about what Camille's voice had sounded like in the last 30 seconds of that call. And I thought, carefully, that I had not destroyed anything. What I had destroyed was the thing that was quietly destroying my son. That was a different project entirely. Camille knows everything. What do you think she's going to say to Gerald? And what do you think Gerald deserves? Tell me in the comments. This story is almost at its peak, and I need to hear from you. Gerald Whitmore's company did not collapse overnight. I want to be accurate about this because the truth of what happened is more instructive than the dramatic version would be. Whitmore Commercial Properties did not fold in a week, did not go bankrupt in a month, did not disappear from the Charlotte skyline in a satisfying instant. What happened was more gradual and more comprehensive and more lasting than any single dramatic event could have produced. The credit facilities went first. Both institutions declined to refinance on their existing terms. One offered significantly reduced exposure at a much higher rate, effectively making the debt service unsustainable, and the other simply declined to proceed. Gerald's CFO, faced with the revised credit landscape, had to inform him that the capital structure the company had been operating on for the past 7 years no longer existed in the form it had existed. The development project investors followed. 2 of the 4 primary investors, after receiving their updated documentation from Gerald in response to their requests, and after comparing it with the questions I had raised with them, chose to engage their own legal counsel. Within 6 weeks of my initial calls, the project had formally stalled. Gerald's announcement of an 18-month delay, framed publicly as a strategic pause, was met with the Charlotte business press with the kind of skepticism that had been building since the information requests became known. The company was not destroyed. I want to be precise about that, because what I had intended was not destruction but consequence. What I had intended was the ending of a particular arrangement, the arrangement in which Gerald Whitmore operated without accountability, in which his leverage over the people around him was secured by the assumption that no one would look closely enough to find its weak points. That arrangement ended. The company had to restructure. Gerald had to negotiate with creditors in ways he had not had to negotiate with creditors in 30 years. He had to account for the development project in ways that were public and uncomfortable. He had to operate, for the first time in a long time, in a world where his leverage was not absolute. That was enough. Elias resigned from Whitmore Commercial the week after my conversation with Camille. He called me the morning after he and Camille had talked, a conversation that lasted, he told me, for hours and covered territory that had been accumulating, unaddressed, for 18 months of marriage. Camille, who was her mother's daughter as well as Gerald's, had the fundamental decency to put her husband above the discomfort of confronting her father, and what emerged from those 4 hours was not a marriage in crisis, but a marriage that had, for the first time since Elias joined her father's company, its actual weight distributed correctly. "She wants to talk to you," Elias said. "I know," I said. "She already has." He was quiet for a moment. "What did she say?" "She said she was glad I called David," I said. I could hear Elias process that. The small exhale of a man whose greatest fear, losing his marriage in the correction of an injustice, had not come to pass. The particular relief of someone whose worst-case scenario has been revised. "I'm leaving the company," he said. "I already told them this morning." "What does Camille think?" "She told me to," he said. "She said it was 2 months overdue." A pause. "Dad," she said, "something that I need to tell you." His voice shifted. The managed quality entirely gone now, replaced by something direct and unguarded. She said the reason I was able to survive 18 months of it without breaking completely was because of the foundation I came from. Because of you and Mom. Because of what we were built on. A pause. She said she wants our kids to have a grandfather like that. The kitchen was very quiet around me. "Tell her she's giving me too much credit," I said. "She's not," he said. Gerald called me 2 weeks later. I had expected this call in the way you expect a structural response after a load change. Not as a surprise, but as a consequence of the physics. He called from his cell phone, not from the office, which told me something about the nature of the call. He asked if we could meet. We met at a restaurant in Midtown Charlotte, Neutral Ground, his suggestion, which I accepted because the choice of neutral ground was itself a signal. A man meeting on neutral ground is a man who has given up on the advantage of his own territory. He was not the same man who had looked down at my son on a marble floor and smiled into a phone. He was a man who had been operated on, who had the particular aspect of someone whose structures have been examined and found wanting, and who has not yet arrived at what comes after that finding. I did not lead with anger. I had spent the anger in useful ways. What I brought to that table was the thing I bring to most situations of consequence: clarity. "You know what you did," I said. "Not the business relationship with my son, the rest of it. The dynamic you created. The position you put him in." He looked at his coffee. "I hear you," he said. "I'm not interested in your acknowledgement of me," I said. "I'm interested in your acknowledgement of him. Elias. Directly. What you did and what it cost him." He was quiet. "He's your son-in-law," I said. "He will continue to be your son-in-law. He and Camille have a future that is going to require both of their families to function with some basic level of dignity. I am telling you what that requires on your side of it." "Camille is," he started. "Camille is her own matter," I said. "Between you and her. I am talking about Elias." A long pause. "I treated him badly," Gerald said. His voice had the specific quality of a man saying something true that cost him something. Not a performance. It cost him. I could see it. "I used the leverage of the position to," he stopped. I wanted to see what he was made of, and I went about it in a way that was, he searched for the word. Contemptible, I said. He flinched. Yes. Tell him that, I said. Not me. Him. He did. I was not present for that conversation. It happened between Gerald and Elias the following week, and Elias told me about it afterward in the matter-of-fact way of someone who has received a thing, acknowledged it, and filed it in its proper place. Gerald had apologized. Not a full accounting. Perhaps, I did not expect a full accounting. Gerald was not built for full accountings, but enough. Enough for Elias to receive it, and put it where it belonged, and move forward from. Miriam flew in from Nashville for Christmas. The four of us, Miriam, Elias, Camille, and I, spent 3 days in the house in Charlotte, in the way families spend time together when they have been through something and come out on the other side of it with each other still intact. Camille made breakfast one morning, an enormous breakfast, the kind that requires 2 pans and fills the kitchen with smell and sound, and Elias sat at the counter watching her with the specific, uncomplicated attention of a man who has remembered why he is exactly where he is. I watched him watching her, and I thought about Diane, about what she had given him that had made him survivable, about what she would say about the past several months, about Gerald and the marble floor and the kitchen table conversation and the calls to David and Camille's 4-hour conversation with her husband and the slowly restructuring geography of all of it. She would say, "You went after him, ZAHA. You didn't let it stand." She would say it with the laugh. She would say it the way she said everything that mattered, directly, warmly, with the absolute certainty of someone who has never been confused about what love requires. On Christmas morning, before the others were up, Elias found me in the kitchen with my coffee. He sat down across from me. The same table, the same chairs, the pot roast kitchen, and he looked at me with the expression I remembered from when he was a child and had something important to say and was organizing the approach to it. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me." "I've been offered a position," he said. "Infrastructure consulting. A firm that does municipal projects, bridges, overpasses, the kind of work you did." He paused. "They came to me through a referral. Someone who knows your work and remembered your name on some old project documentation and thought." He stopped. I looked at my son. "Someone thought a man named ZAHA might want his son on a team building things that last," Elias said. I sat at my kitchen table on a Christmas morning and I looked at my son, 34 years old, his mother's warmth and my precision and the particular quality of a man who has been through something and has come out on the other side of it with his character not diminished but clarified. And I felt something I have inadequate words for. Not simply pride, though pride was there. Not simply relief, though relief was there. Something older and more complete. Something that reached back to my father's workshop and the integrity of the thing you make and forward to every bridge I had ever designed that was still standing and rested, right here, at this table, in this face. "Tell them yes," I said. He smiled. His mother's smile, broad and real, and given without calculation. "Already did," he said. "I am Mr. ZAHA. I am 68 years old." I found my son on his knees on a marble floor, polishing a man's shoes while that man laughed and said he was only good for that. And I smiled and said nothing and got back in the elevator and called my attorney. And what followed was not the story of a vengeful father or a scorched earth act of rage. It was the story of an engineer who understood where the load was concentrated and what would happen if it was redistributed. Gerald Whitmore's company is still standing. Diminished, restructured, operating in a smaller geography with more accountability than it has known in 30 years. But standing. Because I did not want to destroy a company. I wanted to end a system. The system that had put my son on that floor. That system is gone. My son is building bridges. My father would have appreciated the symmetry. A man who knows where the weight is carried knows where to apply the lever. But a father who knows his son's worth knows what the lever is for. ZAHA. If this story moved you, if the marble floor, the kitchen table, the Saturday morning call with Camille, or that Christmas morning conversation between a father and son reached something in you, please leave a comment below right now. Tell me which moment made you catch your breath. Tell me what you would have done with that phone call in the elevator. Tell me what this story meant to you about fathers and sons and the things worth protecting. Every single comment you leave keeps these stories alive and tells me to keep writing. Thank you for reading every word. It means more than you know. Thank you so much for watching my story all the way to the end. Your support means everything. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.